He circled the red C on my sketch with a Sharpie and said, "Not everyone gets to be an artist. Some people are just meant to admire from the sidelines." His voice wasn't cruel. That almost made it worse. It was calm, final, like a doctor giving a diagnosis he'd made up his mind about before even checking your pulse. I was 19, a sophomore at a small liberal arts college in Indiana. My name is Leah. Biracial, my mother is Mexican-American. My father white, though he left before I could memorize his face. I grew up in a town where art was something you did when the power went out and you couldn't watch TV. I was the eldest daughter of a woman who cleaned houses in the morning and stocked shelves at night, who once bought me a pack of markers with her tips from scrubbing someone else's bathtub. She believed in beauty, but didn't have time for it. Art, for me, was never a luxury. It was a language, a secret one spoken in color and texture when there weren't words to explain what it felt like to be quiet in a loud family, to be brown in a mostly white school, to be invisible and aching to be seen. I got into college on a partial scholarship. No one in my family had ever made it that far. My mother wept when the letter came. I remember folding it into a little square and putting it in my wallet like it was a passport. It felt that sacred. My passion was abstract mixed media scraps of memory layers of paper textures you wanted to run your fingers over. I was obsessed with the way a childhood smell could become a color, the way grief could live in fabric, the way dreams could drip off canvas if you let them. I was shy, yes, but my art was anything but. Then came Professor Darnell. Mr. Darnell was the kind of man you'd find in any tenured department, 60-something, steel gray beard, wire-rimmed glasses. He'd been at the college for over 30 years and taught like it was still 1986. He believed in oil paints, charcoal studies, and traditional form. Abstract art to him was lazy expressionism, a crutch for people who didn't want to learn the rules. He showed obvious preference for the confident male students who painted like they were auditioning for the Met. They called him D. He let them. He rarely remembered the rest of our names. Still, I was eager, nervous. I wanted his approval like a child wants gold stars, even though I pretended I didn't. I remember staying up all night for my first critique in his class, gluing pieces of my grandmother's recipe cards into a canvas, thick with acrylic cinnamon sticks lace from an old tablecloth. I called it Memory Feast. When I unveiled it proud and trembling, he tilted his head and narrowed his eyes. "Crafty," he said without even stepping closer. "Like something you'd sell on Etsy." Where's the tension? Where's the technique? A couple of boys behind me chuckled. I wanted to melt into the paint. The next week, I brought a still life. Apples in a bowl. Monochromatic palette. No soul. He gave me a B-. Closer, he wrote in the corner. So I kept sanding myself down. Every week, less color, less risk. More angles, more lines. I was turning into a version of myself I didn't recognize. Palatable, grayscale, precise. I hated every piece, but I submitted them anyway. And he still wasn't impressed. Mid-semester, after another lifeless critique, he pulled me aside in his office. The walls were lined with oil paintings, all done by former students he admired. All of them looked the same. All of them were male. He didn't even look up when he said it. "Leah, I've been doing this a long time, and I can tell who has the instinct and who's just dabbling. You're a sweet girl, but you're not an artist. You might consider switching to something else, maybe art history or education." My hands shook as I folded my sketchbook shut. "I don't want to teach art," I said. "I want to make it." "That's the thing," he said, finally looking at me. "Wanting isn't the same as having it." I nodded, because I didn't know what else to do. That night I went back to my dorm room and stared at my application for the department's sophomore showcase, a juried event where selected students got to exhibit in the campus gallery. I'd printed the form weeks ago. I'd already filled it out. All that was left was to drop it off. I slid it into the trash instead. No one noticed. Not even him. It's a strange kind of grief mourning the version of yourself that still believes she belongs. I stopped attending open studio nights. I stopped carrying my sketchbook around. I told people I was just focusing on my core classes. But inside, something was splintering. Not just because of what he said, but because a small part of me believed it. that I didn't belong, that the language I had made out of color and texture was a dialect no one would ever understand. I didn't quit art that semester, but I quit trying to be his version of it. And that would be the beginning of everything. After that semester, I stopped going to the open studio nights. My sketchbook, once crammed with ideas and textures, now sat untouched at the bottom of my backpack, buried under course packets and unopened granola bars. I told myself it was just a break, that I needed space to refocus. But the truth was simpler and sadder. I couldn't bear to open it anymore. The pages felt like proof of something I'd failed to become. I dropped the studio courses from my schedule and enrolled instead in Women in Art History. It sounded neutral safe. The professor was kind, and I liked listening to her talk about artists who had painted in kitchens and laundromats, in basements and bedrooms, who stitched their grief into quilts and shaped rebellion into sculpture. I admired them, but from a distance. Like I was walking through a museum where nothing had my name on the wall. My roommate Kendra noticed first. One night she came home and found me reorganizing my bookshelf again. I hadn't touched my paint supplies in over a month. "You okay?" she asked gently. "I'm good," I said too quickly. "Just busy." She didn't push. She just handed me a cup of tea and changed the subject, but I knew she saw it too, the way I'd gone gray inside. When the semester ended, I packed up my dorm room with mechanical precision. I drove the 2 hours home to our little duplex on the edge of town, where the porch light flickered and the air smelled like the neighbor's grill. My mother greeted me with a kiss on the forehead and a casserole already in the oven. She didn't ask why I looked so tired. She just handed me a dish towel and told me to set the table. It wasn't until my third week home, after one too many quiet dinners and long stares out the kitchen window, that I found myself walking toward the community center on 4th and Maple. I'd seen the flyers years before: free painting sessions, all ages, all welcome. I never went as a teen. I told myself I was too busy, but really I was scared of what I might find or what I wouldn't. Inside, the air smelled like acrylic and lavender hand lotion. There were folding tables pushed against the walls, jars of water-clouded brushes, paper plates holding globs of paint like melted candy. In the center stood a tall black woman with silver curls tucked into a head wrap. Her apron was splattered with colors, and her earrings looked like tiny stained glass windows. "You here to paint?" she asked, as if it was the most natural question in the world. I nodded before I could talk myself out of it. "I'm Miss Maribel," she said, extending a paint-stained hand. "Grab a smock, pick a color. The only rule in here is if it came from your hands, it already matters." I almost cried. Right there in front of the folding chairs and broken fans, and that soft, mothering voice that held space like a chapel. But instead, I smiled and picked up a brush for the first time in months. I didn't know what I was doing. I didn't try to know. I just moved the brush across the page and let it speak for me. Miss Maribel didn't hover or correct. She asked questions like, "What were you thinking about when you made that swirl, and if this painting had a scent, what would it be?" That last one stuck with me. I went home that night and dug my sketchbook out of a box in the closet. Its cover was dusty, the pages stiff. I opened to a blank sheet, and for the first time since Mr. Darnell's critique, I let myself create without fear. I painted late at night while my mother slept. I used grocery bags as palettes and the kitchen table as my studio. The house was quiet, except for the hum of the fridge and the soft crack of summer heat pressing against the windows. I worked in secret, like I was slowly recovering a stolen part of myself. I painted boiling pinto beans and the way their smell filled our home every Sunday. I painted the chlorine of the public pool, the sticky smell of boxed hair dye in the summer, the vanilla of my mom's perfume before work. I painted the musk of my father's old flannel shirt, the one I found in a storage bin he left behind. I painted loss. I painted longing. I painted the version of me that no one had made room for, and then I made the room myself. By July, I had a full series, 12 pieces, each one pulsing with memory and scent and color, each one unapologetically mine. I didn't show them to anyone, not yet, but I looked at them every morning before breakfast. I whispered thank you to the colors that brought me back. One afternoon after cleanup, Miss Maribel walked over with a hand on her hip and said, "You've got something. Baby girl. Not because someone told you so, because you didn't stop." I looked at her paint on my elbows, hair pulled back, eyes tired, but alive again. And for the first time in a long while, I believed her. When August rolled around, I packed my bags for school again. But something had changed. I wasn't going back for the studio program. I wasn't going back for Mr. Darnell or his praise. I wasn't even going back for the validation I used to crave like oxygen. I was going back because I had art to make. Not for them. For me. And that was reason enough. When I returned to campus that fall, I walked the same brick paths with entirely different shoes. I didn't step foot in the art building. Not once. I passed it sometimes out of habit but never slowed down. My major was officially changed to cultural studies, and every time someone asked me why, I just smiled and said, "Art doesn't need a degree to be real." Most people didn't know what to say to that. But I wasn't saying it for them. I started painting again in my dorm room. Late at night, using tea to stain paper, gluing scraps of napkins and letters and old class notes into layered, moody collages. I didn't ask for critique. I didn't show professors. I made for myself. Quietly. Consistently. Like lighting a candle in a room where no one else looks. By winter break, I opened a small Etsy shop under the name Saul Handed, a name my mother once called me after watching me tie-dye a thrifted bedsheet when I was 13. "Everything you touch has soul," she'd said. Soul. That's your light. It stayed with me tucked under the skin. I priced my pieces low, not because they weren't worth more, but because I wanted them to go to people who needed them. The first painting I sold was called Dias de Agua. It was a dripping blend of turquoise and rust, with small shells glued into the corners. A woman in Texas messaged me after receiving it, "I hung this in my kitchen. It smells like my childhood." I cried reading that, because that's all I ever wanted to remind someone of themselves. Once I posted a process video on TikTok, not thinking much of it. Just me painting while Nina Simone played softly in the background. I didn't even speak in it. Just a caption that read, "Art as memory, not perfection." It got over 40,000 likes in a week. My Etsy orders doubled, then tripled. But even with that tiny surge of attention, I kept my world small, focused. I still sat in the back of classes, still ate lunch outside alone, sketching with soup containers as palettes. I wasn't hiding. I was just choosing my own rhythm now. Then one day, during a student-led cultural fair in the student union, I set up a little foldable table with a few prints taped to foam boards. No sign, no prices, just art. A tall woman with cropped hair and a silver blazer walked by, paused, then doubled back. She studied one of the pieces, a muted painting with coffee-stained paper and tiny calligraphy stitched into the edges. "Who made this?" she asked. "I did," I replied, unsure if I should stand or stay seated. She introduced herself as Dr. Martin, an alum visiting for a campus panel on gender equity and philanthropy. "We're hosting a silent auction for the Student Women's Shelter Project," she said. "Would you consider donating one of these?" My hands went cold, but I nodded. Yes, I'd be honored. I chose a piece called Smoke and Sugar. It was about grief and memory layered with pieces of burnt paper and a trace of cinnamon rubbed into the canvas. I didn't expect it to stand out, especially not with all the curated photography and faculty submissions that filled the auction catalog. But that night, Smoke and Sugar earned the highest bid. Dr. Martin emailed me the next morning. "Your work moved people. They want more." A shift began, not loud, not sudden, but real. Emails trickled in. Students asking if I had prints. A local arts collective inviting me to show 2 pieces in their winter pop-up. Someone wrote a blog post about student artists redefining vulnerability. And there I was listed named. I began walking campus with a quiet awareness I had not disappeared. I had simply rerouted, grown around the stone that once blocked my way. One afternoon, while grabbing a tea in the student lounge, a younger student named Ria Tiny, voice big sketchpad, came up to me. "Are you—" Saul Handed. I blinked, then nodded. Yeah, I guess I am. She looked down nervous, then asked, Would you maybe mentor me? I'm trying to get into the spring show, but I don't know if I belong. I felt a familiar sting in her voice. That fear. That ache to be seen before someone else defines you. I'd love to, I said without hesitation. That night we sat in the library and went through her portfolio. Her work was raw, full of stormy lines and stitched-in lyrics. She reminded me of myself, but braver somehow, reaching out when I never dared to. Helping her didn't feel like stepping into someone else's role. It felt like stepping into mine. I realized then I may never be welcome in the halls where people like Mr. Darnell rule, but I was building something just outside their doors. A studio without walls. A gallery without gatekeepers. People started calling it a movement. I just called it home. Junior year started with a different kind of energy. I wasn't trying to prove anything anymore, but I wasn't hiding either. I had quietly built something outside the art department's walls, and now I wanted to widen the door for others like me. So I curated a pop-up show. We called it Unframed. It started as an idea scratched in the corner of my notebook, a collective showcase for student artists who didn't fit the department mold, students who were queer first-gen neurodivergent self-taught, or simply tired of being overlooked. I made flyers, reserved the community hall near campus, set up mismatched easels and used clamp lights from dorm rooms. No entry fees, no critique, just presence. We filled the space with color and music and breathing room. One student projected a video loop of their hands painting through grief. Another embroidered poetry into linen stretched over hula hoops. Someone sculpted a uterus out of rusted soda cans. I hung 3 of my own newest works, bright layered messy with memory and gold thread. The event drew more than I expected. Local press came. One woman from a regional arts magazine approached me mid-cleanup, holding a notebook in one hand and a lavender scone in the other. Are you, Leah? She asked. I nodded, heart pounding. I'd love to feature you. Your curation, your work, your story. I hesitated. I wasn't used to telling it, not all of it anyway. But something in me said it was time. We met at a coffee shop 2 days later. I told her about being 19 and being told I didn't belong. About making art in kitchens and under bedsheets. About building something outside the system that told me no. I left out names, but I didn't leave out the truth. The piece ran the next month. Unframed: The Rise of Leah Torres and the Artists Who Refused to Shrink. It was bold, beautiful, and it made waves. Word spread across campus quickly. People shared it on Instagram. Professors reposted it. I even saw it taped to the door of the Women's Center. One line stood out bolded at the center of the article. I stopped trying to impress the rooms that never saw me and started building rooms that did. But not everyone clapped. I heard quietly that Mr. Darnell had read it. He began whispering to colleagues that I was overhyped, that social media was making mediocre artists feel important. One student told me he'd mentioned my name and critiqued Torres. Her work is decorative. Emotion isn't craft. I didn't flinch when I heard it, not like before. I had learned something crucial by then: when the people who excluded you try to discredit you, it's usually because your story threatens the illusion that they were right. And still, life had its own timing. 2 weeks after the article came out, I received an email. Subject: Spring Alumni and Student Exhibition Inquiry Body. Hi Leah, I'm Nia, the new director of the Campus Art Gallery. I came across the article about your work and found myself moved not just by your story, but by your vision. We're currently curating our spring exhibition, and we'd love to consider your pieces. Let me know if you're interested. Warmly, Nia Caldwell, Gallery Director. I stared at the screen, unmoving. For a full 5 minutes, I didn't breathe right. I wanted to say yes. I wanted to scream it from the roof of the dorm building. But I also felt scared. Not of failing, not anymore, but of walking back into a place that once made me feel like I didn't exist. Of letting them look at me again, really look, and knowing I couldn't control what they'd see. Still, I replied, simple, grateful, direct. Thank you for your kind words, Nia. Yes, I'd be honored to submit work. I have a new series in progress that I think might be a fit. Best Leah. That night, I sat at my desk and began to sketch the first of the new pieces. I painted with a fire I hadn't felt since that summer at home in my mom's kitchen, only now it had grown into something bolder, fiercer, unapologetically mine. I called the series The Ones You Tried to Dim. Each piece told a part of the story I never got to say out loud. One was titled Sharpie Circle, a mixed media work with red ink scrawled over a blurred-out image of a young girl's sketch. Another gallery ghost was layered with transparent fabric, an invisible thread meant to shift in the light, visible only when you looked long enough. And my favorite table of my own, with bright acrylic swirls, and bits of handwritten notes from women I'd met at Unframed, stitched into the border like signatures on a shared story. This wasn't about proving anything to them anymore, it was about reclaiming space. The submission deadline came. I turned in my work. Nia emailed back quickly with words I wish my younger self could have heard. These are stunning, Leah. Honest. Electric. They deserve to be seen. And for the first time I believed her. Not because she said it, but because I had already seen it in myself. The official invitation for the Spring Alumni and Student Exhibition arrived in my inbox on a quiet Thursday afternoon. I was halfway through a paper on cultural symbolism in migrant textiles when the subject line caught my eye. Opening night details and formal program confirmed. I clicked it open, scrolling past the elegant script and catering menu down to the schedule of speakers. That's when I saw it. Opening remarks. Professor John Darnell, Faculty Board Advisor. My chest tightened, that old twinge of doubt crawling up my spine like it had sophomore year. I reread the line 3 times just to be sure. Then I scrolled further down and there it was again, featured artist and guest speaker, Leah Torres, class of 2024. It felt like a cosmic joke. Or maybe a final exam I didn't study for. After years of rebuilding myself from the shards of his dismissal, I was about to be reintroduced on stage under lights by the man who once told me I didn't belong. For a moment, I considered pulling out. Not because I doubted my work, but because I wasn't sure if I could stand in that room and not shrink back into the 19-year-old version of myself. The one who apologized for being too much, too colorful, too wrong. I called Miss Maribel that night. She answered on the second ring with her usual warmth. Well, hey there, baby. You breathing okay? I told her everything about the email, about the lineup, about how every part of me wanted to run the other way. She let the silence breathe for a moment before responding, voice calm but unmistakably fierce. Don't let the person who tried to bury you stop you from blooming where they'll have to see you. Let that man sit front row while you rise. Her words landed deep, rooted, unshakable. Still, I needed more time. I took long walks around campus, journaled until my wrist ached. I painted until dawn, not to distract myself, but to remember who I was now. I wasn't the same girl he critiqued with a Sharpie. I wasn't soft clay for him to mold or break. I had built my own gallery in the shadows. And now the light had found me. 2 days before the opening, Nia, the gallery director, called me in for a walkthrough. The space was bright and open with clean white walls and soft instrumental music playing from overhead speakers. My series hung in a corner alcove, perfectly lit, each piece, spaced just right, breathing with its own story. I stood in front of Sharpie Circle for a while, the one with the red strokes and stitched fragments of early rejection. Nia walked up beside me and said, "This piece holds something, like a wound that chose to become a window." I didn't speak right away, just nodded. Then I asked, "Were you aware Mr. Darnell is opening the exhibit?" She gave a slight knowing smile. I was. He's on the advisory board. Rotates every year. This just happens to be his turn. And you're still okay featuring me? I asked, quieter than I meant to. She turned to face me directly. Leah, your work speaks louder than his opinion ever could. You're not here because we're being generous. You're here because you earned it. His discomfort isn't your burden. I felt something release inside me, a knot that had been there for years. I nodded. Okay, I'll stay. Opening night came quickly. I wore a deep red jumpsuit that made me feel strong-grounded. My mother came up from Indiana. So did Miss Maribel, who brought her easel in the back of her car just in case they needed some real art. She winked when she said it, but I knew she meant it. As people began to arrive, students, faculty, donors, neighbors, I stood near the entrance with a glass of sparkling water in one hand and my breath tucked carefully in the other. At 6:15 on the dot, the gallery lights dimmed slightly, and someone tapped the mic. "Welcome," a voice began. "Please join me in welcoming our Faculty Board Advisor, Professor John Darnell, for opening remarks." The applause was polite, measured. I watched as he stepped up to the podium wearing the same gray blazer he'd worn to critiques my sophomore year. His hands trembled slightly as he adjusted the microphone. His eyes skimmed the crowd and briefly they landed on me. He cleared his throat. "We gather tonight to celebrate the power of visual storytelling work that speaks across boundaries and generations. Our artists tonight are deeply talented, and their perspectives have helped shape this year's most compelling exhibition." That was all he said. No mention of me by name. No forced congratulations, just a neutral script and a quick retreat from the mic. I almost laughed, not because I wanted revenge, but because I no longer needed it. When it was my turn to speak, I stepped forward slowly, heart pounding but steady. I stood in front of the mic and scanned the room. My mother, Miss Maribel, Nia, students I'd mentored, young girls holding their breath. I was once told I began that not everyone gets to be an artist, that some people are just meant to admire from the sidelines. I believed that for a while. A pause. But I've learned that creativity doesn't wait for permission. It doesn't belong to the few. It lives in kitchens and journals, in community halls, in the hands of those who dare to try again. I looked directly at my younger self in the crowd, not literally, but in the eyes of the students who still worried they weren't enough. And tonight I said, voice soft, but sure, I'm not here to prove anyone wrong. I'm here to honor what they couldn't see. Applause erupted, but I didn't hear it. I was already walking back to stand beside my work next to the ones you tried to dim. And in that moment, I knew no one could ever dim me again. I paused outside the gallery doors before stepping in. The soft hum of voices carried through the heavy glass, and I could see the silhouettes of people milling between exhibits. For years I had walked past this very space, peering in like a kid at a window display, wondering if anything I made would ever be allowed to live there. Now my name was printed on the wall in clean serif font under the words, "Featured Artist, Leah Torres." The door opened with a soft push. I entered. The first thing I saw was a table of my own, centered on the far wall, bathed in warm light, its stitched signatures shimmering gently under the gallery spotlights. To its left was Sharpie's circle, no longer angry, but defiant. And there tucked between two columns was Smoke and Sugar, the one that had started everything. They were bigger than I remembered. Or maybe I was just seeing them from a different place now. The room was already half full. Alumni, professors, students, donors. Some looked at me with recognition. Some nodded, impressed. A few stared at my work without knowing who I was at all. I didn't mind. The art was speaking, and this time it wasn't asking for approval, it was holding its own. I walked past a group of undergrads who were huddled near one of my pieces. One whispered, "That's the artist." I kept walking, not out of pride, out of reverence for the girl I used to be who would have given anything to be whispered about in a room like this. I moved through the space like I belonged there, because now I did. And then I heard the microphone feedback, a voice clearing its throat. "Good evening," came the strained voice of Professor Darnell. I turned slowly. He stood at the podium holding a sheet of notes that trembled ever so slightly in his hand. His face was taut, his smile more performance than pleasure. His gaze didn't meet mine as he began. "We are pleased to present this year's Alumni and Student Spring Exhibition," he said. "It's always rewarding to see how the artistic community continues to evolve sometimes in surprising ways." Surprising? He said it like I had wandered in by accident, like I hadn't carved my way here with bruised hands and stitched stories. He didn't mention my name.
Not until the final line. And now please welcome one of tonight's featured artists, Leah Torres. There was polite applause. I stepped forward. I didn't look at him as I passed. I didn't need to. I took my place behind the microphone, hands steady, voice clear. The faces before me blurred into soft shapes of expectation, admiration, maybe even curiosity. Thank you. I began scanning the room slowly, letting the silence settle.
It means the world to be here. I used to walk past this gallery and wonder if I'd ever see something of mine on these walls. And for a while I stopped wondering. I stopped hoping. I paused. But art has a way of returning to you when you stop asking it to please someone else. When you stop sanding down your edges. When you stop apologizing for your voice. A murmur of agreement moved through the room. I want to thank everyone who believed in my work. But I also want to thank those who didn't. Because both lit a fire in me. And sometimes fire is exactly what it takes to forge something true. There was a hush. Then the applause came slow at first, then swelling into something full and warm. A standing ovation. I bowed my head not to appear modest, not because I doubted my worth, but because I wanted to honor the version of me who sat in the back of critique rooms, wondering if she was allowed to take up space. I wanted to tell her, look, you made it, not despite him. Not.
But without him. When I lifted my gaze, I saw Nia beaming from across the room. My mother's hands clapped the loudest. Miss Maribel had tears in her eyes. I glanced at Mr. Darnell only once. He was still standing near the podium, clapping dutifully, his face unreadable. But it didn't matter anymore. His gaze no longer defined me. I belonged to myself now. And so did my art. The morning after the exhibit, I woke up to my phone buzzing on the nightstand. At first, I thought it might be my mom, still overwhelmed and emotional from the night before. But when I unlocked it, I saw notifications I hadn't expected. A dozen DMs, mentions, shares. Some from strangers, some from students I barely knew, some from girls I'd once passed in the hallway and never spoken to. Most said some version of the same thing. You gave me permission to keep going. I almost dropped out of the art program. Last night changed that. I always thought I wasn't real enough to call myself an artist. Now I think maybe I was just listening to the wrong people. I sat in bed holding the phone like it was a letter from a past I'd once tried to bury. I didn't cry, not out of resistance, but because the emotion felt too wide for tears. Like the walls around my younger self had finally cracked open, and she was free to run. In the days that followed, I felt myself drawn back to the place where my healing had first begun, the community center where Miss Maribel had once opened the door for me when no one else had. I asked if they were still hosting free painting nights. She laughed when I asked. We've been waiting for you to come home, baby. But this time, I didn't come to sit in the back and watch. I came to teach. I began leading art therapy sessions on Tuesday nights. We pushed the folding tables into messy circles. We set out dollar store acrylics, paper towels, and unsharpened pencils. No curriculum, no critique, just space. One night we painted to music blindfolded just to trust our hands. Another night we wrote letters to our younger selves and turned them into collages. I watched girls and women bloom from the inside out. Some had scars that still showed. Others hadn't touched a brush since middle school. But they showed up. They created. And they called themselves artists. I had never felt more alive. About a month later, I received an email from the college. Subject: Spring Guest Lecture Invitation, Cultural Studies and Creative Expression. The body of the message explained that Professor Darnell had formally retired. The department chair wanted to expand the perspectives offered in the creative studies courses. They invited me to deliver the first guest lecture of the semester. I reread it 3 times before responding. Yes, I'd be honored. Walking into that lecture hall for the first time in years was surreal. The same auditorium-style seating, the same faint scent of graphite and coffee. But this time I was not holding a sketchbook in my lap, waiting to be told where I fell short. I was standing at the front, microphone in hand, slides ready, and a room full of students waiting to hear my voice. I opened with this, Art is not a club, it's a language, and we all deserve to speak it. Silence followed, not because they weren't listening, but because they were, fully. Some leaned in, some nodded slowly. One girl in the front row started to cry without trying to hide it. I told them my story not with bitterness, but with clarity. I spoke about gatekeeping, about the invisible weight of erasure, about what happens when you let someone else decide your worth. But I also talked about resilience, about reclamation, about the quiet joy of painting in a kitchen at midnight and calling that your studio. I didn't name Mr. Darnell. I didn't have to. His absence said more than his presence ever did. I ended the lecture with a slide that read, "You are allowed to take up space." The room clapped. But more than that, they stayed. After class, a line formed not for signatures, but for stories. They shared their dismissals, their own C's circled in red, their secret sketchbooks and rejected poems. And one by one, I reminded them, you don't need permission, just a place to begin. By the time spring melted into summer, I had launched a free online course in collaboration with the community center called Art for the Uninvited. Enrollment filled in 3 days. We mailed out kits. We opened a digital gallery. I watched as art spilled from dorm rooms, living rooms, prison reentry programs, halfway houses, and libraries. It was everywhere. And not once did I ask if it was good enough, because it already was. One evening I walked into the gallery again. The exhibit was being rotated, but one of my pieces, Gallery Ghost, was still up. They told me students had voted to keep it there as a permanent installation. I stood in front of it, remembering how long I had tried to make myself invisible in this space. Now, my work lives here, not behind glass, but woven into the very walls. I wasn't just seen, I was part of it. The sun filters through the tall windows of my studio, casting golden streaks across the floorboards. This space mine still feels like a small miracle. The walls are soft white, the kind of white that reflects light without swallowing it. My brushes sit in old mason jars on the windowsill. Canvases lean against the walls, some unfinished, others complete, but waiting for their moment to be seen. The smell of linseed oil and sage lingers in the air, comforting and familiar. My mother is here today. She's framing one of my newest pieces. Her fingers are steady, her eyes focused. She hums while she works a tune she used to sing when we were little, back when she was sewing patches into our jackets and making beans stretch for the week. It feels right to have her here. She was the first person who ever called me an artist, long before anyone gave me a gallery or a grant or a mic. It was her voice that made space for mine. I glance up at the far wall above my desk. Nestled between 2 shelves is a single framed flyer. Spring Alumni and Student Exhibition, featuring Leah Torres, opening remarks, Professor John Darnell. I didn't frame it to be petty. I framed it to remember. To remember the girl who walked out of his classroom head down, dreams chipped and shaking. To remember how many nights I painted alone, whispering to my younger self, "You're still allowed to try." To remember that sometimes our greatest canvases are built from the wreckage of dismissal. That flyer isn't a trophy, it's a timeline. And every time I see it, I don't hear his voice anymore. I hear mine. Sometimes I sit here when the studio is quiet, no students, no calls, no deadlines, and I record voiceovers for the podcast I started last year. It's small but growing. Women send in their stories about art, about rejection, about starting again at 30 or 60, or after a divorce or after a diagnosis. I read them. Sometimes I cry, sometimes I laugh, and then I respond the only way I know how, through story. Today I press record. The red light comes on and I begin. He said I'd never make it. I pause. But maybe what he really meant was that I'd never make it under him, that I'd never succeed in his class, in his structure, in his image. And maybe he was right, because I didn't become what he thought an artist should be. I glance over at my mom. She gives me a quiet smile, without looking up from the frame. I keep going. 4 years later, he stood under the spotlight I created. Not just the light in the gallery,
But the one made from every no, I turned into a new kind of yes. He didn't get to define me. He just got to introduce me. My voice catches for a second, not from hurt but from awe. Awe at how far the story has come. Awe at how small his power feels now, when compared to the ocean I built inside myself. In the end, he gave the opening speech. But my art, I take a breath, spoke louder. I end the recording. The light clicks off. And for a moment there's only silence. Then my mother walks over and hands me the finished piece. It's framed in oak. The colors are warm and bright, pulled from memories of kitchen tables and healing hands. I look at it and realize I never needed his approval. What I needed was this: a room of my own, a wall that belonged to me, a voice that no one could mute. I hang the new piece beside the framed flyer, not as contrast, but as evolution, a reminder that what begins in rejection can still end in radiance, that the loudest art isn't always painted in bold colors but in unwavering truth, that the final stroke belongs to the one who never stopped painting.